Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm John Strickland, Director of JLS Consulting, which is a London-based air transport consultancy. I'm delighted to be here with the airline programme for this year's World Travel Market. This is the first in a series of 3 panels we'll be running. There's going to be a great opportunity to learn this afternoon from some key speakers in African aviation. As you see, the title of a presentation or the title of a session is Out of Africa. Now, Africa is a market which I personally know less about than a number of world aviation markets. It's a market which we've never covered before at the World Travel Market, and it's one which presents a lot of opportunities and a lot of challenges, but we've got the leading players here today to tell us about their different activities in this particular market, this continent. I say leading players, we've got 2 leading players and we've got a newcomer who is hoping to become a leading player. So let me introduce my panellists first of all. To my immediate right we have Ed Winter, who is the CEO of the new arrival on the scene, FastJet. In the middle we have Tewolde Gebremariam, who is Chief Executive Officer of Ethiopian Airlines. And to my far right, I'm delighted we have from Kenya Airways, we have Mbuvi and Ngunze, who is the Chief Operating Officer of Kenya Airways. So welcome to London to all of you gentlemen. Well, as I mentioned, Africa is a continent which presents opportunities and challenges. It's perhaps the least developed in terms of air traffic. And I'm just going to read a few lines, which is actually from a recent release by FastJet, but it's not a plug for FastJet. It's a very good resume of where Africa is today. Africa is a growth aviation market with regional and intercontinental traffic, both growing rapidly as a result of the continent's continued economic expansion. With over 1 billion people, Africa is hampered by poor infrastructure, a lack of roads and railways, and long distances between urban populations. The African aviation market is significantly underserved, with air travel spending as a percentage of GDP a fraction of that of other emerging markets. With rapid economic growth, and as a result, the growing wealth of African citizens, more and more people will be able to benefit from aviation and fly for the first time. So that really sets the scene, and if we think of it, another figure that Africa today has about 68 million people travelling by air. That's predicted to rise to about 130 million by 2030. So there really is an opportunity. Very, very pleased that the 3 gentlemen we have here are from the major players, the ones who are leading the way and setting the tone. So without spending any more time, we're going to turn to hear what they have to say about their particular business models. There'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions as well as we go along, so feel free to put your hand up. We'll get a mic to you in due course. So Ed, if I could just hand over to you first of all, just if you'd like to give us a quick summary of what do you propose to do? What is FastJet's objective, and what type of business model are you going to be bringing into Africa?
Okay, John, as you say, we're the new kids on the block. We're bringing a whole new, different product to Africa. It's not just a different brand or a different airline, it's a whole new product. We're bringing a low-cost airline, a Pan-African low-cost airline to sub-Saharan Africa. We're launching later this month in Tanzania, and we're launching off the platform of Fly 540, so that gives us AOCs in East Africa, in Tanzania and in Kenya, and in Angola and Ghana. We intend going well beyond that, and the intent is, over a fairly short period of time, to create a Pan-African low-cost airline, FastJet, which the consumer will be just one airline across the whole continent, but albeit a combination of local airlines subject to local regulatory authority.
And what type of aircraft are you going to be using, Ed?
So they're Airbus A319s, a well-proven aircraft in the rest of the world, somewhat new aircraft for that part of Africa, but we're getting great support from Airbus, and we've got 3 aircraft so far. Those 3 will be on their way to Dar es Salaam in the next few days.
Thanks, Ed. Tewolde, Ethiopian Airlines is a very well-established airline, I think 65 years old, am I correct in saying that? Could you give us a little summary of your current business activities and business model?
As you said, it's 66 years old and one of the leading airlines in Africa. Historically, Ethiopian Airlines was established in 1946 with a management contract and technical support with TWA. Since then, it has been growing, and the growth has always been aligned with the growth of the continent. Back in the 60s, where many of the African countries were getting their independence from colonization and the formation of the Organization of African Unity. Ethiopian Airlines played a key role in bringing the new nations and also in the economic development of nation building process. And that's also where we introduced the jet service to the continent. And then in the 80s, when the Boeing company came up with 767, at that time very new aircraft, we were the first in Africa to introduce the 767 and second in the world. And in 2010 also, we were the first to introduce the longest range commercial airplane, the 777-200 LR. And last August, again, we introduced the 787 Dreamliner. We have 3 of them in service and the 4th one coming next Friday. So in a nutshell, it's an airline carrying 4.8 million passengers a year, operating about 55 airplanes, growing fleet as we speak, because just in the month of October only, we had about 6 new airplanes joining us. And we are also significant cargo carrier in the continent, carrying about 182,000 tons a year with 6 dedicated freighters, 2 757, 2 MD-11s, and 2 777s. We are in the 3rd year of our Vision 2025, and hoping everything goes per our plan. By 2025, we plan to grow the airline to 120 airplanes, carrying 18 million passengers per annum. And
what is your passenger figure today, did you say? Is it
4.8?
4.2 million.
Yeah, so...
Let's come back to that in a few minutes, Tewolde. I want to ask you about that Vision 25, but just thanks very much for now. And Mbuvi, you were telling me earlier, you're a newcomer to the airline business. You've just been in Kenya Airways for about a year. Have you learned the history of the company for which you're now working? Can you give us a quick resume of Kenya Airways' proud heritage?
Yes, Kenya Airways was formed out of the previous East African Airways, which was the airline that was operating across the 3 East African countries, Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. That broke up in 1977, and Kenya Airways was formed from that, so 35 years now. Kenya Airways was privatized, was a government entity until 1996 when it was privatized. Actually, it was the first company in Africa, airline company, to be privatized in Africa. And that's when KLM came in as a strategic shareholder. KLM have been in shareholder of Kenya Airways since that time. From 23 destinations at the time to 59 today. So we strongly in Africa, 47 destinations in Africa, 12 destinations out of Africa, 38 aircraft today, a mix of 777, 767, 737, and Embraer aircraft, carrying about 3.6 million people a year today.
Great, thanks very much. What I'd like to do now, coming back to you, Ed, and I really would be very happy to get each of your opinions as well, Mbuvi and Tewolde. You're bringing the low-cost model to the African continent. I mean, it's there in some places, arguably in South Africa, yep. To a small extent in some of the North African countries, which perhaps have short-haul links to Europe with communities such as Morocco in particular. Let's take a look at the low-cost model. You believe it can work, but I think we'll probably hear from your colleagues they're not quite so convinced as you. So do you want to tell us in a few words, why do you think it can work, and why is, in your view, Africa waiting for this?
Well, I think up until now, currently, African aviation is actually orientated towards business traffic, tourists, and high net worth individuals. The average person, the average man in the street, doesn't think about flying. It's not something that's accessible to him. And as a consequence, connectivity and the amount of aviation taking place in Africa is incredibly low by comparison to the rest of the world. If you look at propensity to fly, two seats per head of population per year in Europe versus about 0.02 in Africa. Aviation is incredibly expensive at the moment, average 32 cents per seat kilometre versus about 8 cents in Europe. So lots of reasons there why the average man can't fly. Now, over the past few years, the wealth that's flown into a lot of these countries from oil, gas and minerals is now growing GDP, but not just growing GDP, it's spreading through the population. Whereas in the past, that wealth might have actually only filtered into a very small percentage of most of the populations, it's now spreading through. And so there's a much larger group of people now who are able to fly. Now, they can't fly on legacy carriers, they can't afford those sort of, they don't want those sort of expensive frills. But the low-cost model as it started in Europe, a genuine low-cost model where we take out the frills, where people only pay for what they want, enables us to bring fares which I believe will enable all those people to travel. So we're democratizing air travel. It's people who currently, if they want to go to a wedding or a funeral, could spend a day or 2 days on a dangerous bus journey or whatever, or even can't go there, will now be able to travel by air. So lots of reasons why people would want to travel, and I think the time is right. 3-5 years ago probably was too early, and I think now when we see what's happening in terms of the economy in these countries, political stability, inward investment, a lot of things are changing. The political will to change people's lives, and I think now is exactly the right time to bring that sort of product into Africa.
Thanks, Ed. Tewolde, you've heard Ed's, you could say, election campaign there for the low-cost model coming to Africa. You're a man of much experience in Ethiopian Airlines, and I know, speaking to you before, you've got maybe more caution, more scepticism about this. Can you explain what is your view, what is your response to what Ed is saying there?
Yeah, we are more experienced in African air travel, African aviation, but we're not more experienced in the low-cost model. But from what we understand, I think first, which type of low-cost model, because I don't think there is a single low-cost business model. The successful ones that we have seen so far in the industry vary in whatever they do, and in the success factors also. It may work, yes. We have not really made an in-depth study and research. I'm sure FastJet must have done research. But the African air travel market is slightly different from what we have seen in Europe and the United States. There is a culture issue. There is also, it's not homogeneous market in terms of regulatory framework, cross-borders, cross-national policy issues, coordination of policy in terms of being able to fly across the borders with the simplicity and flexibility that we observe in Europe and the United States. And I think also, again, we've not done much of a study, but the markets are more fragmented than what we have seen in Europe. But let's see, it may work.
Okay. Now, Mbuvi, not only am I sure you've got a different view, but you know, FastJet intends to come right into your backyard, into Kenya. What is your feeling at the moment? Do you share some of Tewolde's cautions about the nature of the African continent, or are you getting ready for a bit of a fight in your backyard?
I say the more the merrier first. But even as Kenya Airways, we announced a year and a half ago that we were looking at low-cost operations through Jumbo Jet. We're still doing our homework. It's not something that you just go and launch, because you want to make sure that you don't just create a mini KQ with all the bureaucracies and all. It must be a different operation. And we're still doing our homework. We've recently gotten our air services license. And we will not just react because FastJet are coming in. We know our business model. We know what we are trying to do today, and we'll continue delivering that. And we'll work on the other option for us. I agree with Ed on one score, that Africa, there's a lot of opportunity. It's true, we've seen it. We've been the ones opening up Africa over the last number of years. If you look at Africa from a population point of view, It will be larger than India and China in the next 10, 20, 30 years. If you look at the growing middle class, significant growth. If you look at the income that will be available, if you look at the mineral wealth of Africa, so there's opportunity. But I also share Tewolde's caution around the fact that still very fragmented from a country's perspective. So we've got to be deliberate in a step-by-step process, and we'll take our view. When we are ready, we'll launch, but we still have the business model that we're operating today. It's working for us. Africa has been very positive for us. We've seen strong growth, and we still continue to intend to focus on making sure Africans travel within Africa, even within our existing operations.
And you've announced this new subsidiary company within the Kenya group of FastJet, and you have aircraft even delivered, I think, the Embraer series of regional jets. Have you defined that business model yet, or is that part of the homework?
That's part of the homework. Actually, the aircraft we are getting today, the Embraer aircraft, are actually flowing into Kenya Airways' mainstream business today. For Jumbo Jet, we have said we will finish our study and then decide what we'll do. The aircraft that were licensed for Jumbo Jet are actually the 737s that exist today, the Dash 300.
Okay, so we hear that there are buoyant conditions as economic growth. There's wealth coming through a massive population. I think one of the things that the two gentlemen mentioned there was fragmentation. I mean, do you see that as an issue, and the lack of homogeneity? Is that more of a challenge than it would be in, say, in Europe when low cost came here?
In some parts of Africa, it's an opportunity. Like if you take West Africa, the ECOWAS region, so the Economic Community of West African States, there are 16 countries there which purport to have a free trade area. People can travel without passports and so on. And yet 400 million people almost in that grouping, and Accra, the capital of Ghana, sitting geographically in the middle of that, is only connected on a daily basis to 4 of the other capital cities. Now, there's that lack of connectivity. People in Conakry, up in Guinea, if they want to travel down to Accra, they go via Paris because there isn't a connection. You know, that sort of thing happens over there. Now, yeah, you could say it's fragmented, but it's a group of people, a group of countries who are trying to form a free trade area, form that sort of collective community, and aviation has let them down. So there's a huge opportunity there.
And in the markets you've picked, I mean, there's a reason for you picking these 4 markets, because you're working with a group called Lonro, which is, it's not an innately aviation group, it's a multiple trade business, I understand. It's been in Africa for about a century?
Yeah. In fact, where FastJet came from, our genesis, was Lonro Aviation. Now, Lonro has got about a 106-year history in Africa, in all sorts of areas, agriculture, mining, logistics, and so on. And it's changed its shape many times over the years. But it had formed an airline, in fact 4 airlines, called Fly 540. And those 4 companies exist in Angola, Ghana, Kenya and Tanzania. And we've taken that Lonro Aviation group and put that into FastJet. So FastJet PLC is what was previously Lonro Aviation. And what we're doing is transforming each of those 4 and other countries developing into FastJet. Now, Lonro is a key part of this because you've got Easy Group and Stelios and all of our background in successfully starting and running low-cost airlines, but that's supported by Lonro, who really understand how to do business in Africa. And they're a huge help, both their reputation, but also their assistance and help in terms of how we work in Africa, because it's not the same as working in Europe or the States or anywhere else. It is a different country, a different culture, and Lonro understand that. So that's a key plank in our development.
And in terms of these 4 countries, have you detailed yet your plan in terms of sequence? You're going to start in Tanzania?
We're starting in Tanzania. We decided to start in East Africa. Basically, Air Tanzania, a number of years ago, had already gone through the process of putting the Airbus A320 family onto the register there. And so the airworthiness inspectors, the flight inspectors, had already been to Toulouse. They already had all the knowledge there. So that made that process a lot easier. Easier than Kenya. But we will be going to Kenya as our next base very, very soon. I think Ghana will probably come 3rd. Angola's got few more challenges, although I think Angola could well be the jewel in the crown in terms of those 4 eventually.
And have you announced any particular routes as yet? Are you on sale, in fact, for the first
No,
routes?
we'll be on sale in the next week or so. We haven't announced the routes yet, but they're pretty obvious which routes we will be flying.
Okay. We'll have a little prize draw afterwards for a couple of tickets on the first flight.
Yeah.
Just switching away from you for a moment, Ed, and back to the other business models. I mean, Ethiopian, Tewolde, you were saying about the long heritage and your plans to grow substantially by 2025 that you're calling Vision 2025. It's quite amazing. You've got, I think you said, the third 787s already in service and the 4th one's coming. And indeed, you're the first airline in Africa to have that aircraft in service, the third in the world. So your model is based more on connecting Ethiopia not only to other parts of Africa, but to other parts of the globe. And tell us a bit more about the kind of markets you're developing into. Are you really taking opportunity of the kind of new boom in rising economies in different parts of the world, which in the past it would have perhaps been hard to imagine would have supported air services?
We're using the same business model for the last 66 years. And going forward also, we're going to use that business model because it has been successful thus far, and there is an opportunity to grow the business with the same line of business model. And it's only that in the last 7 years we've seen tremendous growth. We've experienced tremendous growth. And if we just compare 7 years ago, we had 14 airplanes. Now we have 55 airplanes. 7 years ago, we were carrying 1 million passengers. Now 4.8 million passengers. So in all shape, form, and size of the business has grown about 4-fold in 7 years. So that was also by design, because we had what we call Vision 2010, where we aimed to grow the airline from $380 million annual revenue to $1 billion, and to grow also the other parameters in the same way. So by 2010, we have achieved most of our targets. In fact, we exceeded in most of them. We closed $1.3 billion in 2010. And then as soon as we did that, then we had to think for another growth period, which is Vision 2025. And that was also aligning with the fleet renewal and fleet modernization. That was the time where we placed the order for the Dreamliners and also the A350. And fleet modernizing, fleet acquisition by nature takes a longer period. So by 2025, the fleet is going to grow to 120 airplanes, number of passengers to 18 million passengers. And the cargo also in the same, it's going to reach 820,000 tons. So in terms of transformation, what we are doing now is transforming the airline to an aviation group in the diversified aviation business model, meaning we have been an airline by and large with some ancillary services, predominantly meant to serve the mainline operation. But now we're developing those services also to be profit centers. And these are like cargo, MRO, and the airline, we're going to divide it into international airline and also domestic and regional. The Aviation Academy is a huge business opportunity.
Just tell me a bit more. You mentioned that you went from 14 routes to about 55 in less than 7 years.
Aircraft.
And you're going to go to over 100 routes by 2025.
Right.
And you've committed to the latest aircraft. Those aircraft are not cheap to acquire. How do you develop a confidence in ordering these new planes that there's going to be a market for them? Do you look at the markets first, then place an order, or do you place an order and then think, oh, we've ordered them, now we've got to work out how we're going to use them?
Well, like my colleagues, we also believe in the growth of Africa. It's a region, a continent which is in a fast growth trajectory. And also we are going to develop the Addis hub to a more successful, more well-developed network as in terms of being the best entry gateway to the continent. And we are also planning to expand the hub system to regional hubs. You must have heard about an airline called Aska in West Africa, in Lome, Togo. That was with the intention of developing a hub there next to FastJet in Accra.
Yep. I have tried your product.
And we intend to multiply that kind of hub expansion in the continent because, look, the continent is a big continent, 1 billion people. Right now it's about 1.6 trillion GDP, but that's going to grow very fast in the coming 10 to 20 years. And the natural resources in the continent is now an attraction for the rest of the world, particularly China, India, and the West. The West is now also waking up in terms of its perception about Africa. So internally, the continent is going to grow fast. There are all the indications for this growth, and also the trade relations, especially with China. And Chinese focus on the continent, that is also the driving growth.
That's been a fundamental change, isn't it? I mean, you mentioned the West is waking up, but the West, perhaps you could say, could have had its opportunity, but it's been a bit sleepy, but China just got on and started to do it.
Yeah, yes, the perception in the West has not been very encouraging, and it has always been looking at Africa as a marginal market, and sometimes as a dark continent. But now that is completely changing and changing very fast, and China realized that quickly. And now if you see the Chinese investment in the continent, whether it is in Angola, South Africa, Ethiopia, Zambia, Kenya, Sudan, it's huge investment. And it's also well managed and directed by the government. So it's a good solution for infrastructure development for Africans, and also a good solution for the Chinese in terms of strategic access to natural resources, and particularly oil. So it's a win-win situation, and that is working very well. And
Mbuvi, I'm just going to switch to Mbuvi for a moment because I want to see, I think you are sort of trying to take a piece of this cake as well, if I'm not mistaken. But Kenya Airways has switched more from a continental focus to international, and I think you're going to launch some Chinese destinations as well.
I think it's fair to say that if we talk about Africa, where will Africans want to travel for the future? The reality is, if you look at the balance of trade and travel today, it's actually east to west. North-south flow, Europe and USA still has the largest size of trade with Africa, but declining. In terms of trade between India, China and Africa, as well as Latin America, it's growing by over 150% a year. And that is why I think Tewolde is talking about this transition. And if you see what is happening, because of those investments by China, by India, and by even other countries, Vietnam, people are coming for employment to Africa. People are also doing trade. A lot of Africans are traveling for trading, for sourcing purposes into China, into India. And for us, that's
so it's not only a one-way flow, because I mean the perception could be from a distance, certainly for somebody like me, is that all right, the European colonials came and pillaged Africa in the past, but it's just the same with China today. But you're saying no, there's a proactivity on the part of Africa as well, also going in the other direction. And
when you look at the flows, actually from a trade point of view, there's actually an interesting balance of flow, because there's raw materials traveling one way, and there's other goods coming the other way, and finance also coming the other way. So there's actually proactivity on both sides. Obviously, China today is really focused on natural resource extraction. But when I look at it from a people flow point of view today, definitely the attractive markets today and for the future will be much further to the Far East and to India. And we will put our capacity as we grow, as we get new equipment into those markets. Still be strong in Africa, because we've got to be a strong player in Africa and make sure that we are also making sure that Africans are traveling within Africa, because that's our mainstay. We want to make sure that we are in every African capital in the next 3 years. Well, that's a goal for KQ. And to drive that connectivity and increasing of frequency, because that will also work as a bulwark against competition, because we are not the only ones who are playing in this market. The reality is, if you look at the share of African aviation capacity, we've actually lost share as African carriers over the last 10 years. We've lost probably about 10%, and the people who've actually gained that are the Middle East carriers in terms of flow into Africa. So we've also got to find the correct balance.
Well, let me ask you a question about that, because I remember we've had Tim Clark from Emirates has been here at the World Travel Market in previous years, and I remember him saying when Emirates launched its route from Shanghai to Dubai, it became 90% full within about 2 months of operation, which is quite unusual for a long-haul route. But he said it was not passengers going from China to Dubai, it was passengers going from China to Africa. And Emirates has now built an enormous network into Africa. Qatar and Etihad are doing the same kind of thing. Here in Europe, we hear a lot of criticism of these Gulf carriers that are so successful. Would each of you be equally critical, or are there boundaries to that criticism? We'll just get you to continue for a moment, Mbuvi.
I think we will face more competition from them. The reality is that there might be some non-leveling of the playing field, but we have to work with that. That's a reality. And we've got to play defensive and be strong in our home markets, which are the African markets, because that's where we have to be core, and not try and replicate the travel into every destination they fly, because we'll probably never be able to do it because we don't have the same firepower that they have. But pick up markets where we can be strong and drive those. That's my perspective.
Tewolde, do you share that view of the Gulf carriers?
Yeah, I do. Competition is going to come from all directions. Of course, more and more from the Gulf carriers, because they have a big strategy, they have a huge expansion plan, and one can see at the number of orders of airplanes that they have. Perhaps among 3 of them, they must have about 500 airplanes on order. So it's a huge competition. But what is more concerning and more worrying us is the market share. As my colleague said, all African carriers put together today, we have only 18% of the market, 2 from Africa. And 82% of the market share is by non-African carriers. This is a concern to African carriers. We have to work together, we have to cooperate more and see our fair share, because there should be competition, and we have to encourage competition both among ourselves and also with the rest of the world, but it has to be fair. So at least it has to be 50-50. So this is a major concern, and partly it's also, I mean, as a continent, it's our own making, because the African airspace today is more open and flexible to non-African carriers than to African carriers. So we have initiatives like the Yamoussoukro Declaration among ourselves in the continent. It has gone as far as it did, but it has not gone as far as we wanted it, or as far as it was planned.
That declaration that you mentioned, the Yamoussoukro Declaration, was a declaration by African governments at the end of the 1990s, basically signing up to kind of open skies, liberalisation of air services.
Within the continent.
Within the continent. Yeah. Did it allow access to overseas carriers, or was it liberalisation, as you said, only amongst African-owned airlines?
You know, again, this brings us to the lack of coordinated regulation in the continent in terms of continent-wide or regional cooperation and integration in aeronautical policy. Yamoussoukro Declaration was meant to allow African carriers to fly wherever they want within the continent. But at the same time, each and every country has a bilateral air services agreement with the rest of the world, with other countries. So today, while the Yamoussoukro Declaration was going very slowly, implemented by some countries, not implemented by others, the bilateral air service agreement of each country with its counterpart outside the continent is allowing more and more carriers to the continent. That's how we find ourselves the way we are today.
Ed, just as a point of detail, I mean, how is FastJet going to be defined in ownership terms? Is it going to be an airline, or is it going to be an airline flying in Africa but owned by...
No, it's very much an African airline. Each of the airlines that forms FastJet is very much an African airline. We don't intend flying outside Africa, but the debate about the Gulf carriers and so on is quite interesting, because I think the reason why there's only 18% versus the 82% is the sort of strength of aviation within Africa needs to develop. It's such an undeveloped network within Africa that sort of flows through to allowing that imbalance to take place in intercontinental traffic. But I see another add-on for us as a regional carrier, because we're going to operate and we are going to be a very reliable airline. I think it'll give inbound tourists from the Middle East, from Europe, or wherever else, a lot more opportunity to fly around. Because apart from on airlines like your two airlines, people coming in are very wary of flying on African regional airlines. Certainly in West Africa, nobody wants to move around on local airlines. And I think having a strong, recognised brand of a reliable airline, FastJet, will provide that for those inbound passengers.
Yeah, let's just dwell on that point for a minute, because Africa, again, at least in terms of perception, is often seen as maybe the unsafe continent. And I don't know if this figure is still valid, but I think there was a figure from IATA in the past that Africa accounted for, was it 5 or 6% of air traffic, but 25% of incidents or accidents. But it varies a lot by country, and there has been a lot of focus in recent times. You're an operational man, Ed, from an operational background. You would have flown to Africa as a pilot in the past, I guess, on long-haul flights.
Yeah.
Do you think there is will, from what you see in the areas you're talking about with FastJet, to make progress on these fronts, to bring Africa up to the same level of safety as the rest of the world?
Yeah, absolutely. I think at the moment, with a few notable exceptions, African aviation is chronically unreliable and not at the same level of safety and security that you'll see in the rest of the world. Now, we've stated an absolute intent on our part that we will operate to European standards regardless of requirements locally. And we intend doing that. Now, you look at infrastructure in some parts of Africa, it's going to be a challenge. But we've spent a lot of time looking at the areas where we need to make change, looking at how we would do that, and we're absolutely determined to bring something which is very reliable, safe and secure.
And gentlemen, Tewolde, you wanted to lead on this. I'd ask both of you.
A little bit I disagree that African aviation is not safe. It is safe. It's only localized, isolated 2 or 3 countries where we have the very weak regulatory framework, and that is putting a wrong perception. Otherwise, most of the continent is, there are global brands like Kenya Airways, South African Airways, Egypt Air, Ethiopian Airlines, Air Morocco, and Tunis Air, and so on. So, very few, as I said, localized and identified where there is governance issue, there is lack of peace and stability issue in those countries. And as a result of that, of course, the aviation regulatory framework is very weak. And guess what? Most of the problems in those areas are also foreigners coming, operating very old airplanes. So, it's not fair, or it's not accurate to categorize as a continent like African aviation is not safe. Is the safety record between Eastern Europe and Western Europe the same, or some part of Asia, or So
a good point.
It's a huge continent.
Mbuvi, is that something, I mean, you're new to the industry, but obviously you know this is an issue that gets talked about. What is your perception?
In fact, the interesting thing, if you see the IATA statistics, actually, safety incidents in Africa have actually gone down over the last 3-4 years. And actually, I think last year was the best recorded year. So there is a very strong improvement in terms of air safety. And there's no question, I agree with what Tewolde says in terms of it being localized incidences. And you can name them, and those ones really tip. Because once you have a hull loss, it's there. It's an incident. It will be recorded as such. The one thing, though, is also we are also investing a lot as airlines in improving those safety, because we engage civil aviation authorities. In some places you even have to invest because you invest for safety. Today, for example, Kenya Airways has partnered with GHS to drive safety in Africa. So safety audit, so that everybody is IOSA, we can do the consultancy to try and drive that safety progression in Africa. And I think those sort of things will drive it. We go to some places. I remember one, I'm told before I joined the airline, we were going to fly to Kisangani, and we had to buy a fire tender for Kisangani in order to be able to provide the safety that we wanted to be able to operate there. You've got to make some of these sacrifices, but that's a reality if you want to fly to these places. So I think we cannot wait as airlines operating in Africa for somebody else to do it. If we want to drive safety, we have to do it ourselves. And I think that's a big mission and investment we have to drive.
And is that something that Kenya Airways and Ethiopian Airways is looking to do? I mean, you're the banner wavers for the continent in many ways, the leaders.
We do it. We do it on an ongoing progressive basis, and we engage civil aviation authorities, airport operators, continuously on safety improvement. So it's part of our mandate to make sure, part of our mission to make sure that we're operating as safely as we are everywhere where we go.
Yeah, I would agree. And I said that there are exceptions, and the major airlines like yourselves do drive that sort of level of safety. But there's still very large areas of Africa where the regional carriers just have an horrendous record, and they're chronically unreliable.
Can I just touch on another issue?
Maybe just to touch one thing. Probably the one area where we have to see more improvement from a safety point of view in Africa is actually air traffic control and coordination of air traffic control across the regions. And I know there are certain initiatives being driven, but that's one area, because there are some places where, as you flying at night, for example, or large patches of the continent that are not properly covered on an ongoing basis. And that is an area where we could work together to actually drive from an African perspective, and there's initiatives on that score. And that could actually improve and increase the density of travel, because then you could even have more operations at night. There are some places today we choose not to operate flights at night. So assets sitting idle because you cannot fly because of air traffic control issues. But actually those assets, if you could utilize them better, you could increase the density of travel across those places because the demand is there.
What about the government side of things, the issue of bureaucracy, taxes, corruption? Can we just knock those three off? You two are experienced in the industry. You've had to deal with this for your businesses. I guess it was the same in other industries, Mbuvi, not only the airline industry, Tewolde, you've had it in airlines. Could I ask you two, first of all, what is your perception of progress on these issues? Is it a tortuously slow process with bureaucracy? Is it a case of you've got to do the right thing with the right person, or is that being pushed away more for more professional ways of business, Mbuvi?
I think the one thing we have to acknowledge is that we have seen a transition in Africa with a peace dividend over time. And with peace dividend comes a lot of democratization of institutions and improvement in the way people do things. So that in itself is also benefiting business right across. And I'm not talking only about aviation industry, I'm talking right across industries. So that move definitely is helping. There are challenges, obviously, on the CAAs and the ministries on BASA issues. You have some countries where you have only a certain number of frequencies that you can do in a week, and with a certain type of aircraft, even though the demand is there. So you'll always get some of these bottlenecks coming through, but you have to deal with them. And I think you have to be patient, you have to engage, you have to drive a lot of continuous communication. And the challenge is you're dealing with different governments across Africa. But I think We have been successful so far in opening up Africa because people who we deal with see what you are doing, the contribution you're driving to the economy, and the progress that you're bringing in. And it's not by luck that we are where we are in terms of our density of connectivity in Africa. It's been painful, it's been tough, but it has been rewarding even to those countries. And when you have conversations today, people actually can say, okay, we see the change you have brought through. So you can say that there will be corruption. Countries, there might be corruption, you might have bureaucracy, but we're making progress. And I don't think it's all doom and gloom. And people see what you're doing and see the contribution. So I prefer to look at it from a positive
way. Tewolde, did you share that positive outlook as well?
Yeah, yes, these things are there, and we've been living them, especially for old carrier like Ethiopian Airlines in the continent. But at the end of the day, as Mbuvi said, we have to be seen as economic driving engine by the African countries and by the African public. That is what has been helping in the process. Otherwise, the regulatory framework, again, is very weak. There are no strong rules, and even if they are not enforced properly. So it's a challenge we've been working through. But in the process, we are able, especially the big carriers in the continent, we are able to establish a strong brand in the communities, in the African communities, that these airlines are really contributing to the economic development, socio-economic development. Today, you don't see a neighboring country to visit their neighbor to go through Paris or through Europe, not as bad as it used to be because of the carriers. And it has been painful, as Mbuvi said. I remember in my 28 years with the airline, I remember that we used to fly from East Africa all the way to West Africa with more crew on the airplanes than the number of passengers. So it's very painful, and that's how we developed today. Today, most of our flights are full east-west route, but 20, 30 years, that was not the case. In terms of corruption, in terms of bureaucracy, it is there, but I think it's a global problem. It's not only African problem. In recent years, we have seen Enrons and WorldCom, and it's a different of corruption in its own way. So it is improving. The governance issue is improving slowly. The democratization process is improving. I think in the last 1 to 2 decades, the continent has made big improvement.
And Ed, is this something that fills you with trepidation, or do you think you can cut through these barriers and bureaucracies?
No, I think on the sort of bureaucracy side of things and corruption, and find your way around how to deal with business in Africa and avoid those traps. Lonra have been great help to us because they actually obviously understand the area. But the other subject you touched on there was taxation. And that's something which I think really does need to be addressed. Over the past years, governments have treated aviation as a source of wealth tax, because the people flying have been businesses that have not been particularly sensitive to price, tourists, so it's one-off, and high net worth individuals. So particularly over in West Africa, where you've got departure taxes for local flights as high as $120, $130, that is a real disincentive to, it makes it almost impossible.
3 times higher than the Ryanair average fare.
Yeah, it must be way higher than our fares, so that stops you from stimulating the market. Also, if you look at the fuel tax that is applied in many places, to have a fuel tax as high as it is, say, in Accra, that encourages airlines to fly 6 hours from Europe, tankering fuel for the return journey. So in 6 hours, you burn 25% of the fuel you bring down with you.
Just to fly.
But the differential in price is so high that it's driving that sort of behaviour. It's crazy. Now, we've had lots of discussions with governments over this, and I think people are beginning to understand now that if aviation is going to expand, if you're going to develop the sort of wealth and economic benefits of proper aviation connectivity, you have to change these practices. And I think departure taxes need to come down to a sensible level, and fuel tax in particular needs to change. And they're understanding that, and I think the overall benefit to governments as the market increases will obviously give them a greater net benefit.
Thanks, Ed. Let's throw this open to the floor. Let's see if anybody has a question.
One point just
Okay,
on
sure.
tax before we leave the point of tax and go to the floor.
We can just get a
There's
mic.
There's also double taxation and the lack of double taxation treaties across the different African countries, and that means that you're not able to transfer the funds, or you're taxed twice.
Yeah.
You make money in one place and then you get taxed at home, and you're not able to take the tax credits, and that's another big issue across the African continent.
Right, thanks, Billy. If you could just introduce yourself and let us know who you'd like to ask the question to, please.
Okay, my name's Peter Phillips. I run Skyland Connect. We're part of the Centre for Essential and Public Service Aviation. And that kind of immediately suggests my question, which is to the panel in general, that what I'm hearing is urban thinking from everyone, rather than the kind of thinking that Africa often needs in terms of air transport. When Ed says that the average African consumer doesn't think about flying, many in fact have no choice because their communities are so remote, and therefore the expense of flying is actually part of the way that those communities survive and people save lives. So democratizing air transport only in urban centres in Europe seems to me to be something of a red herring, because the rest of Africa requires issues that are about safety and access and a lack of fragmentation. Africa may well need a non-European or non-US model for its flying. Following the European experience, that may well mean that smaller airports may get cut off. And it strikes me that the safety issue that you talked about is in remoter regions, where you're not seeing large aircraft, you're actually seeing ATR 42s or less. When you see Cessna Caravans with their appalling safety record operating, then it does strike me that the requirement is for a different kind of approach and not to copy what Europe and the US have done.
Let's put that question now to the panel, just to
Okay,
get some
thank you.
feedback. Who would like to lead on that? Mbuvi.
I can start, and I like what you say. If you look at the country like Kenya, actually there's operators at the different levels. There's secondary airports and there's tertiary airports where different operators, Cessna, ATR, etc., actually operate, and it's either tourism or actually trade business. A lot of tourism business into lodges, but also people traveling into more remote areas where there are non-tarmacked airports, and the operators who do that. From a density point of view, of course, as a business, we've got to strike a balance to decide at what level do we want to operate at. So do we want to operate only jet aircraft, or do we also want to penetrate that next level, which is turboprop market, or partner with that level? And there are different players in each rank. So I can tell you even the densification. If I look at East Africa, if I look at Tanzania, if I look at Uganda, if I look at Rwanda, each of those countries have a next level of actually operators. There's a question, of course, of improving safety in those areas, and it's important that we also focus for those, because if the reputation is driven that the airspace is not safe, be it at jet level or that level, then we will all be sort of painted with the same brush, and that is true. And I challenge the assertion that we have only urban thinking. Actually, it's interesting. If you look at the passengers who travel with us are not urbanites. If you look at the people who are coming from Mali going to Angola, if you look at the people who are going to trade from markets in Nigeria as far out as Kano, who are going to China or to India to actually do trade, it's not urbanites. It's actually the ordinary individual out there. And you'll be surprised. I mean, when you travel, the first time I joined, when I joined the airline industry, and I was looking at the profile of our customers, I was used to doing a lot of north-south traffic. A lot of that is, suited people, the kind of people around here. But if you look at the east-west traffic, totally different and very interesting. And you must treat that traffic very differently because it has actually a lot of potential and money. Our frequent flyers today, our frequent flyers and people who are on platinum and lit are not actually a lot of corporates, are actually traders. Very interesting perspective. So not really urban thinking.
Tewolde, do you want to add to that?
I partly agree because, well, not the urban thinking, but whether we will be able to copy the business model in Europe and the US in Africa. Again, as I mentioned before, we have, I don't want to be very pessimist on FastJet business model, but within a country, within the countries, as Mbuvi mentioned, Kenya or Tanzania, the domestic market, Ethiopia, Sudan, the domestic market is significant. And there is, although at a low scale level, there is some possibility. But cross borders, one, the trade relations between the neighboring countries, between African countries, is not as much as developed as the trade relations with the rest of the world. And therefore the travel is also at its initial stage. Two, which part of the business are we going to make low cost? The airport operation, the flying, or the marketing, and how? Again, the business model may answer these questions, but it may work, it will work, but it takes a lot of investment, in my own opinion. A lot of investment in terms of route development, and a lot of investment, and but in terms of the profile of African travel, I agree with Mr. Mbuvi that it's all a cross-section of the society, especially the traders, the Africans who would like to, who are now traveling to India, China for business. It's a mixture of smaller corporate, more of traders and more of the general public. But in terms of country to country, it's at the initial stage.
Do you want to throw in a
Yeah,
comment?
just very briefly, I think you talk about the European model, like the low-cost European model. We're just using that to the extent that using our knowledge and our ability to drive cost out of the business. Clearly, everywhere is different. We need to be pragmatic and accept the way things happen in Africa compared to Europe. And I think we clearly are not going to try and address the Cessna Caravan market and the ATR 42 market with a low-cost model. But what does happen, I think, is aviation of all types, so the traditional carriers, we will develop a much greater connectivity with low-cost airline. That drives change throughout the whole market. And so as we develop, I think you'll see those carriers who are operating at that level, operating at a much higher level of reliability and quality.
Thanks. Another question just over here.
Gentlemen, Victoria Moores from ATW. Picking up on a couple of themes there, one question on the low-cost side and then a separate question on the sort of Chinese investment into Africa. So probably directed more towards Tewolde and also to Kenya Airways. Could we see more Chinese investment or more Indian investment potentially coming into African carriers? You've both got fleet expansion that you need to fund. Is that something which you've explored or which you've been approached about? And then on the low-cost side, a separate question. We had a very good presentation from Richard Bowden from FastJet in Abu Dhabi at Roots, discussing all of the details of the African market and how FastJet is looking to challenge those, and how you're actually having to take different actions to the traditional low-cost model, like using travel agencies for distribution. Could we actually see FastJet interlining or code sharing, which obviously isn't necessarily the traditional low-cost model in Africa? And equally, everybody up there is doing the low-cost thing. Tewolde, could you consider doing low-cost with Ethiopian as well, setting up any kind of low-cost arm? Thank you.
Right, Tewolde and Mbuvi, first of all, are you likely to be getting investment from China, for example, in your fleet expansion plans? Tewolde.
No.
Okay. Tewolde?
Not so far, but I think there will be, if not investment, there will be cooperation.
With Chinese carriers?
With Chinese carriers. It could be commercial cooperation in its various forms. It could also be equity investment, but definitely we see that currently or thus far, the Chinese carriers have been overwhelmingly very busy in the Chinese domestic market. It's a huge market for them. But going forward, they will be going out international, and therefore Africa is in their strategic radar. So they will be coming and they will be cooperating with African carriers in various forms, as I said. In terms of investment, it all depends also on the need of the African carriers.
Okay. Did you want to add something?
I wanted to qualify and say yes, like Tewolde says, we are members of SkyTeam, so we cooperate a lot with Chinese carriers, China Eastern, China Southern, and we fly into their hub in Guangzhou. So we hope that in the future we would like to see the Chinese carriers using Kenya and Nairobi as a gateway into Africa, because we're pushing a lot. We're already seeing a lot of traffic coming through, for example, from other SkyTeam partners in Vietnam and others. So it definitely will be, that's part of the strategy of SkyTeam, to make sure you can partner from that perspective. From an investment point of view, I guess I say no, because there have been no advances, and as Tewolde says, I don't think it will happen soon, because they're already busy, their financial model, their investment is significant, and it will take time before some of them also go into profitability. So to think of probably investing will take time. India is another kettle of fish. You asked about India. I don't think everybody is looking to invest from India right now.
We have enough problems of their own to sort out at the moment.
Yes.
Ed, the issue of distribution or changing the business model to accommodate Africa, I mean, it's interesting. On the one hand, we see in Africa this incredible revolution that's taken place in mobile phone usage, way beyond maybe what's happened in Europe. Yet the internet, which has been fundamental to the beginnings of low cost here in Europe, is perhaps much more in its infancy. I think I was reading Ethiopia internet penetration is less than 1%. Mbuvi, I think you were telling me about 10% in Kenya.
It's probably between 10 and 20%.
To come back to Victoria's question, is that meaning you're going to have to use travel agents, or do you think it's going to be an education?
You just need to accept being pragmatic. Like, we went into Eastern Europe, for example, with the low-cost airlines. We found that credit penetration was low, and internet penetration. So we had to find different ways of doing things. So in Africa, we will use the travel agents to start with. We'll try and drive a different model with them. Mobile phone technology, great, because there are in some countries more mobile phones than there are people. And if we can drive sales through the mobile phone, through smartphones, in East Africa, there's M-Pesa, where people pay for things using their mobile phone. In West Africa, there's mobile money. All those things are there. But don't forget, things change very quickly. It's easy to think that in Europe, we've always used credit cards and we've always used the internet. When I was at Go in 1999, the year after we started, we actually passed 10% of our sales on the internet, and we speculated as to how high it could possibly go. And I recall that Barbara Cassani and I came out thinking it might go as high as 50%. It wasn't very many years before we hit almost 100%. So it's not that many years ago that things weren't happening in Europe in that way. So I don't see why Africa won't change as well, but you just need to be pragmatic, to accept what's there and find different ways of distributing.
And Tewolde and Mbuvi, do you share that view? Do you see the internet will progressively rise and become more important in terms of airline sales?
It will, but again, the speed of penetration and the speed of the cultural change. We have Africans living in Europe and America, and what percentage of us using the internet to buy tickets, we'll have to see. So it's whole transformation, cultural and infrastructure the mobile phone mobile banking can replace credit card, but right now close to 70% of our sales in Africa is through travel agency. The remaining 30% is by and large, again, our own office sales. The internet part of our sales is very significant. I don't know, KQ might be much better than ours, but still, it's very low. It's very insignificant. How fast can that change? Maybe FastJet can change it quicker than we did. But I think it's a little bit a long way.
What's your view, Mbuvi?
I believe it varies from country to country, and it depends on the level of development in countries. If you say, for example, internet use in Kenya, it's pretty high, and you find a lot of people actually booking on the internet. So that varies. But the thing I would say I would like to nuance it will be between the internet and money transfer. If you look at the money transfer model, for example, M-Pesa in Kenya, M-Pesa is actually the biggest bank. Safaricom is the biggest bank in Kenya by deposit in terms of how much is held in transaction currency within the network system. And if we can leverage that, and we are driving that, because I personally would like to see much more leveraging within our business of those transactions. You can empower a lot of people who don't need to go through intermediaries, and people can pay you directly. And depending on the country, you are seeing more of an evolution. So it will come to pass. It will happen. Africans today, I mean, the density of mobile phone usage in a lot of African countries today has gone past 50%. And a lot of people are actually using money transfer as a mode. So that, for me, is where the opportunity lies.
Yeah. I read somewhere recently that M-Pesa, I can't remember how many years it's been running, has actually had $7 billion transacted through it over its life, which is huge.
Huge.
Yeah.
It's phenomenal.
Interesting stuff. Any last calls for questions from the audience? Well, regrettably, we are running past our time.
I think I have not answered one.
Oh, what's another one? Did you have another part?
Low
What was the
cost.
third part? Two more bits. Just remind us what they were.
Low cost. You asked if Ethiopian Airlines
whether
will go
you do
low cost.
model.
No. Even ASKY is a full service network.
Okay, and the other one was, would FastJet consider interlining or code-sharing at all?
Well, I've always had a bit of a mantra with low cost that complexity drives cost, and try and not get complex. So I'd never rule anything out totally, but I think it's very unlikely.
Well, with that, I think we're going to have to draw it to a close. So thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for coming to our session. But in particular, thanks to our panellists, Mbuvi and Ngunze from Kenya Airways. Thanks for making the trip over from Nairobi to London. Tewolde, Gebremariam from Ethiopian Airlines. Thanks for coming in from Addis. I hope you're flying back on a 787, or at least a 777. And Ed Winter, thanks for coming in so close to the first flight of FastJet. Sorry?
We will fly Ed back.
Okay. Position is echoed back. Thanks very much to all of you, and we have the next panel tomorrow, 2:30, looking at facing the challenges. So have a good evening, everybody. Thanks a lot.